Hi, everyone. This is going to be episode 5 in our review of the book Paul on Trial, the Book of Acts as a Defense of Christianity by John Mauck, a attorney in Chicago. He wrote this in 2001. It's a groundbreaking book. It explains a foundational document of the Book of Acts as written for probably, most likely, a magistrate judge assisting Nero in an appeal. Unbeknownst to Mr. Mauck, this actually was already written about in 1720, as a matter of fact, looking at early church records by Mr. Heumann, and he dug those up. Mr. Mauck didn't have any idea about that analysis. Of course, it was all written in Latin and was probably very difficult to find, but we'll go through that a little bit here. Anyway, this episode 5 is going to focus on an issue: who is Theophilus, to whom Luke addresses his gospel, the Gospel of Luke, and the book of Acts in the first few verses of each book. And we'll begin. Okay, and we would just want to recap what we did in the last episode. We showed the evidence is overwhelming that there could not possibly have been intended, the book of Acts, to be read by Christians, because it's so antithetical to accepting Paul as a Christian. If you knew that it was written for a magistrate, you would maybe read it more critically. We don't read it critically anymore. But in Acts 16:16, the Python priestess, her name is you don't even see her name is the Python. That's erased in all translations. They just call her a soothsayer. But the word there is Python. And that's a special Python priestess, a world-renowned figure in Europe. And she has a sister group in Delphi and a sister group in Philippi. And whatever these priestesses do and say in their prophecies, they speak with glossalia. They just murmur and mumble, and a priest has to translate what their words are. And her words go all across Europe. They're news every day whenever she speaks, and people pay for her prophecies. And somebody thinks it's important, they give the certified letter. This is a government office she's holding, and the priest gives a certified document that then can go be used to proclaim whatever you want to proclaim in your letter. I mean, so she's an important figure of world history. And Mr. Mauck didn't catch it because it's not it's the Greek is correct, but the English translations do not say the word Python, so you never know to look up the word. Who is this person? That's Romans, pagans would go, this is fantastic. She's endorsing Paul and his way of salvation for many days. That's Acts 16:16. Well, of course, we're going to vote for him. That's number one. Number two is the Jesus of the Damascus Road, according to Paul, actually is quoting from a play, verbatim, the Euripides play of Dionysius called Bacchae. And Jesus is actually using words that were similar to how the character or of his own existence. Dionysius was a son of God who comes down to earth, empties himself of what makes him equivalent to God, and then he is killed, dies, and then resurrects. I mean, perfectly scripted and put in the words in the mouth of Jesus by whoever's making this story up. Would Jesus do that? Now, Paul isn't. I believe Luke is a very ethical person. I have no doubt he's just recording whatever he's been told. But it's a very fantastic story in order to persuade the pagan rulers. The third thing is in Mars Hill speech. Paul says the temple is not made of human. God, the Creator, does not dwell in temples made of human hands. As a result, that no Christian would accept that, because we all know God dwelt in the temple made with human hands, and Jesus said so. But the Romans, the pagans, the Greeks, none of them believe the gods live there. They live on Mount Olympus. They live outdoors. They don't even wear clothes. Have you ever seen the statues of these people? They don't wear clothes, except the women. So the bottom line is that passage is meant for pagans to like Paul, not for us to like Paul, because we would know he's speaking contrary to the word of God. Of course, God lives and dwells at the temple at Jerusalem, and had for a couple of millennia until the first temple was destroyed and it was rebuilt, and again until after the time of Paul. It was destroyed in 70 AD. And then the other thing I wanted to mention, I forgot to mention in the last episode, in Luke, in Acts 28:11, he mentions Paul's ship that was going from Malta to Rome for this appeal. It had two figureheads of two gods on the front, Castor and Pollux. Now, That sounds insignificant to us, and we just goes in one ear and out the other. But basically, it's saying the ship is being protected by these two gods. Why would Luke add that detail for Christians? He's doing this because pagans care about these things. They believe in these things. They're superstitious. So he put it in there for them, not for us. There's many details. These are the top four, I'd say, that prove what the thesis of Mr. Mauck is valid, because we can see evidence it was not meant for us. We were not meant to see Paul in a good light by any of these four things. Now, we're going to begin, and we're going to look at this. Let me start here. We are asking the question in this video, who is Theophilus? Why is he being addressed? Theophilus, to whom Acts is addressed, is a common name of that period. Luke's manner of addressing him is as one who would address a Roman investigator or official. The book of Acts presents Paul's case that he was an Orthodox member of a sect within the Roman tolerated religion of Judaism. And Paul was in his ceremonial bath at the temple when Trophimus, his companion from Ephesus, transgressed the temple's warning about illicit entry beyond a certain point. The book of Acts is designed to address the concerns which a pagan ruler would naturally have to determine whether Christianity was truly a sect within Judaism or was instead teaching principles that would disrespect the sanctity of the temple, which Rome itself protected under its standard principles of Pax Romana. As Mr. Mauck states in the book, Luke Acts was written as a legal defense of Paul as he awaited trial before Nero and was intended to bring the gospel to Theophilus, even as he, Theophilus, gathered facts concerning the charges against Paul. That's in his book at page 4. So the book we're reviewing, for those who haven't been part of this series, is called Paul on Trial, the Book of Acts is the Defense of Christianity, Nashville, Thomas Nelson, 2001, and this is at page 4. And I've said this in the prior episodes to those who have already been here, but for those who haven't been here before, this is a must for every Christian to read this book. A must. It gives you a completely new perspective on what the book of Acts is, which is so misunderstood and therefore has been misused by people who basically didn't know any better. But in hindsight, it almost appears unscrupulous to have left us so ignorant and not told us what this book was for, even though it was well known in the church and revived in 1720 by Mr. Heumann. But anyway, I digress. Let's continue. Now, Joshua Roeder, in a book called Representatives of Roman Rule, Roman Provincial Governors in Luke Acts, published by Walter de Grooter in 2014 at 6, explains that Heumann in 1720 had the same view as Mauck about Theophilus as magistrate preparing the case for Nero's appellate hearing in Paul's case. Quote, he says emphatically, in other words, from the book of 1720, Theophilus was a pagan magistrate to whom Luke addressed his book as an apologia. So, but that book is in Latin, and it's something we're going to have to dig up to get it, and we'll know more about it one day. But right now, we're just showing you that Mr. Mauck was on the right track without even having any knowledge of this work, already having covered the same ground, but using early church records to prove the same exact point. All right. Now, while Heumann of 1720 relied upon early church records that Mauck had no knowledge about, Mr. Mauck proved it by common sense, starting with how Luke addresses him in Luke 1. Most excellent, Theophilus. So let's go into that. Now, we're going to do a lot of reading here. So, but if I keep interjecting too much, it'll take too long to get this done. So I'm going to just try to read it, make small comments, and we'll keep going. This is page 7 in the small Roman numeral, so it means it's introductory material. The information revolution is reaching back 2,000 years. In the Gospel of Luke, chapter 1, verse 3, the reader, Theophilus, is introduced with the title, Most Excellent. Those two words raise a flurry of questions. Even a decade ago, it would have taken years of study at a university with the right research facilities or consultation with one of the few scholars possessing a lifetime of accumulated specialized knowledge to answer one of the simplest of those questions. What people were addressed as most excellent in Roman times? Traditional Bible teaching explained most excellent as a title for a Roman official. Was that teaching correct, or could those words or that title have been used with any person? Intrigued, I, Mr. Mauck, located at Tufts University Classic website to search an extensive database of Greek and Roman writers, using English, Latin, or Greek words to quickly locate the usage of the term most excellent among ancient authors. The Bible teachers had been generally right on this point. Quote, in quotes, he says, most excellent, as a form of address was used primarily as a title for rulers or government officials. And he mentions a little humorous anecdote here, except by the obsequious Cicero, who would call a cow Madame if he thought she would give him more milk. Not quite sure why he put that in here, but anyway, it's intended for humor. All right, now moving to the next page. I contend that Luke investigated, gathered facts, borrowed from other sources, and edited them for a different and definite purpose. He wrote a legal brief to defend Paul against charges of fomenting civil insurrection, and by extension, to defend all of Christianity against the charge that it was an illegal religion. His original reader, Theophilus, was, the evidence will show, the Roman official responsible for the judicial investigation of trials to be conducted before the Emperor Nero. I just want to add one little thing. He never posits whether the original church was behind what he was doing or he was doing it independently. So we don't know. Luke could have just simply been trying to defend Paul by taking this evidence together, or it appears more likely to me that he was trying to defend the church and Paul, because there's some exculpatory passages that would put the 12 in a better light than Paul, and that's precisely in Acts 21 verses 21, where James, the bishop of Jerusalem, comes to Paul and says, "We've heard rumors that you are guilty of apostasia from Moses," and that's the first sign of any information coming to the 12 of what we see in Paul's letters. But I digress. So let's keep going. Okay, continuing. Theophilus. He is the mysterious reader whose identity holds many of the clues of Acts and Luke. He is mentioned only twice in the Bible, at the introduction of Luke 1:3 and Acts 1, verse 1. However, these mentions are highly instructive. Luke 1, verse 1. Since many have undertaken to set down an orderly account of the events that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed on to us by those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and servants of the word, I too decided, after investigating everything carefully from the very first, to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the truth concerning the things about which you have been instructed. Next is Acts 1, verse 1. In the first book, Theophilus, I wrote about all that Jesus did and taught from the beginning, until the day when he was taken up to heaven, and after giving instructions through the Holy Spirit to the apostles whom he had chosen. Now, Mr. Mauck recommences after that quote. From textual gleanings and from the evidence which has preceded and will follow, we can deduce some aspects of his relationship to Luke and Paul, and why Luke wrote to him. Theophilus probably was a Roman official. In his first book, Luke addresses him as most excellent, a salutation used for a Roman official. Although Theophilus is a Greek name meaning lover of God, the name was common among Greeks and is serendipitous to the context. While some have suggested the name represents a generic John Doe who is seeking to learn of God, the salutation most excellent and the reference to his previous instruction belie that suggestion. Numerous passages in Acts will support the conclusion that Theophilus was neither a believer in Jesus nor an inquirer. Also, from the omitted details in Acts, which Luke omits because he assumes Theophilus knows them, and from the supplied details in Acts, which Luke supplies because Luke assumes Theophilus needs to know or be reminded of them, we get a firm sense that he is a particular, real individual, not a fictitious persona. Next heading, the events fulfilled among us. In Luke 1, verses 1 to 4, Luke tells Theophilus he's writing to him because he wants to create an orderly account of all things from the very first, that you may know the certainty of those things in which you were instructed. Having been told that Theophilus has been instructed, we deduce he already knew something of the story of Jesus, his disciples, and Paul, the things fulfilled, the events which have come to pass by AD 62, and which Luke will show were God ordained, foretold in the Jewish scriptures, and spoken by the prophets. From this introduction, many scholars have concluded that Luke had a theological agenda in writing. They are correct, but only in a limited sense. A legal apologist for a man accused of creating, under Roman law, a religio illicita or illicita, an illegal new religion, would necessarily engage in a theological excursion. Now, next, Mr. Mauck has intervening text, and then he wants to list 6 interactions between Luke and Theophilus, and I think they're very interesting because they're mentioned by Luke, and they prove much more depth of detail. So this creates a picture that you otherwise don't get by just reading Acts and don't reflect on it. So Mr. Mauck has done the reflection and then puts those reflections here to help us understand it better. So here we go. There's going to be 6, 5 on this first page. Prior to being given the book of Luke, Theophilus had been given much information about Jesus and or the Messianics and or Paul. Because Luke is aware of this, he will be writing to extend and organize that information. 2. Luke wants Theophilus to have greater certainty about the information he has already received. The careful investigation recounted in Luke 1, verse 3, coupled with Luke's expressed desire that Theophilus be more certain of his facts, allows for the possibility that Luke may be giving Theophilus his compilation so that Theophilus can verify the facts himself. 3. Luke and Theophilus must have interacted when Luke gave him Luke. And that's what I think is so interesting, is I hadn't thought about it. He's writing the book of Luke. Well, I just always imagined he was writing both books simultaneously, but he makes a good point, and he's going to prove to why he believes this from a textual, with the way the address is made in the book of Acts to just Theophilus, and I'll let him explain that. So let's go with his theory and listen how he makes it sound reasonable. Luke and Theophilus must have interacted when Luke gave him Luke. It is self-evident that Luke expected Theophilus to read his first book, and that such a work would evoke many questions, such as what happened after Jesus was taken up to heaven and possibly occasions to converse. And he's right. The address in Acts 1, verse 1 is about, he references, in my prior work, I told you this. So clearly the book of Acts is given at a different time. And so Mr. Mauck is going to suggest that means Luke writes the book of the gospel, and then he brings that to Theophilus. He goes back and he writes the book of Acts, and you'll see he's going to say it's 1 year. Let him speak. Number 4, Luke and Theophilus knew each other over a period of time. As Theophilus was reading the first book, Luke was writing Acts, which took perhaps at least a year to assemble and write. Number 5, the formality of the relationship between Luke and Theophilus, between the writing of Luke and Acts, changes. By the time Luke gives him Acts, the formal salutation, most excellent, has been dropped. He's called simply Theophilus. That's very observant. That he could see there was something had changed. Why wouldn't you be as respectful as you were initially? Because you actually probably visited with Theophilus when you brought him the gospel, and maybe even told him about it. So that's very good reading and good critical analysis. Okay, and then here's number 6 of the 6 interactions between Theophilus and Luke that you can infer from the facts. Theophilus probably knew what happened to Paul, since shortly after Paul arrived at Rome, the narrative of Paul's 2 years at Rome covers only his first 3 days, and then a few more days, leaving a span of almost 2 years between Acts 28, verse 28, and Acts 28:30. Of course, prison time may be uneventful, but because the 2 years in Rome were closer in time to the writing of Acts than any other times covered in it, the memory of those events would be better, and if Luke's purpose is not forensic, the significance probably greater. Yet Luke covers 2 important years in 1 verse. So in other words, I think what he's trying to say is that this was done so close in time to those 2 years that Paul's been there. He doesn't have to recount anything that happened in those 2 years while Paul is waiting. That means Theophilus has been on this case this entire time. You don't need to tell him what he already knows happened in those 2 years while Paul was at Rome. There might have been hearings and things like that. He doesn't have to recount any of that. Now, imagine a separation of a whole bunch of paragraphs and other stuff, and he makes an observation that makes you think here. He says that Theophilus was educated at least to the point of literacy and fluency in Greek, but no necessary knowledge of other languages. So you can tell that Luke knows Greek, Theophilus knows Greek, and that means Theophilus has to be a very educated person, because that's not normal. Latin is the official language of Rome. Greek is the language of philosophers, the language of scientists. It's a way, there is a communication in mathematics that way, but you would have to be, and in law, but you would have to have a sophisticated education and knowledge to know Greek in a level of literacy and fluency that is necessary to understand even the book of Acts. And apparently Theophilus has that. So again, that puts him in that rarefied position of probably being the magistrate judge assistant to Nero. And it's very interesting that I mentioned is, why are our gospels translated into a language that only the elite can read? Why? It seems to me very likely, and that Mr. Mauck didn't speculate about this, but I'd say it seems to me very likely that our Mark, Matthew, everything, even, well, John is written in Greek later, but actually, see, John's written in Greek for a different reason, because when he writes that, he has assistance. I think it's from Polycarp. I can't remember now who it is, but he's well known who it was. He assists in all the writing of the book of John. And that's why it's this very polished Greek. If you look at the book of Revelation as a person, it really looks like a person who was born with Aramaic, studied some Greek, and wrote out a book, which it's rough Greek. It's a consensus of all experts. But the Greek of the Gospels is super polished Greek, and it reflects the input of the person who was helping John write that gospel. So he hand wrote it down as it was being narrated by John. That's the understanding at the time. That's recorded in early church history as well. And I'll dig that up one day. I don't think that betrays anything about the inspiration of it, because I trust John had picked a good person, and the person he picked was someone who was a faithful follower of Jesus Christ as well. So I think that we can take John's gospel as reliable in its preparation as well. Okay. And so I think I might have mentioned this already. I think that, yes, I did, I think the evidence is now stacking up that the reason our gospels were changed, or were prepared in Greek, can only be explained by this trial. What else would impel us to do this? Unless you can prove our gospels were written much later, at the time of Marcion. Marcion was this rich shipbuilder in 144 AD. He might have had an interest in having our gospels written in Greek. I don't know. But is there evidence in any way that our gospels were originally written in Greek for who? What Christians were speaking Greek? Who could read Greek? I mean, it'd be like, what's the point? Why not put in Aramaic? That would be the most natural place to see it. And the Gospel of Matthew was said to be in Hebrew. Some people say that's just a way of saying Aramaic at the time, and that's a whole nother dispute. What would be the language of the Bible, the Hebrew Matthew? Anyway, so let me see if there's anything else here. Oh, yes, I have one more thing, and or maybe a couple more things here. Okay, hold on. I got a couple more things to go. Okay, now the other interesting thing is Mr. Mauck observes that he's going to use his own lawyer skills to show that it's unusually clear that Luke is mentioning the irregularities that would be of importance to a magistrate, somebody who knows the law, advising Nero on the appeal. So listen to this. This is page 25. Luke frequently mentions procedural irregularities or violations which would be patent, meaning obvious, to a Roman legal official. Because he does not label these irregularities, Luke does not label these irregularities as such or explain them. It appears that Luke expects Theophilus to see them. Examples include, now I just want to suggest one thing that nobody ever thinks about, Mr. Mauck didn't think about. Luke, he's mentioning all these irregularities, which to me tells me that Luke is an attorney, not a doctor of medicine. He's a doctor of law. That's my own opinion. And so as I read this to you, think about, why would Luke know these are all illegal irregularities? Mr. Mauck can recognize it. He's a lawyer. It's just something that lawyers after you learn how to recognize legal irregularities yourself, you just think everybody else can read a text and just see the legal irregularities. But that's not something you inherently get by just, having a non-legal education. You're not going to recognize legal irregularities, but when you are trained, it all pops out and to you. So I think Mr. Mauck himself didn't see how could Luke recognize these things unless he's an attorney. And that to me is who he is, my personal view. He was an attorney hired by the church to do a job for them, and that was to get the gospel done, which, I'm going to digress just for a second here. Professor Edwards wrote a book called The Hebrew Gospel and the Synoptic Tradition. I may have misrecollected that in a couple episodes, so that's the true title. The Hebrew gospel and the synoptic tradition, in which he shows that Luke's gospel is closer to the Hebrew Matthew than even the gospel of Matthew in Greek, by virtue of the quotes we have from it in early church, like in Jerome and in other sources, and they match what Luke has, but those same passages don't appear in Matthew. So it's very interesting, very curious. So it appears to me that the Hebrew Matthew was given to Luke by the church as an attorney. Please translate this and give this to Theophilus. In other words, it doesn't mean that Paul didn't have some influence by saying something to Luke, but it, to me, he was given a job by the 12, by the apostles, and that was his task, to take this and help them win this appeal. That's his job. So anyway, and that's how our Hebrew Matthew got translated. So otherwise, why would anybody have translated it? And it was. Okay, now here we go. So here's the legal irregularities that Mr. Mauck can see, and I think Luke sees because he's not a medical doctor. A, Felix's promise of a speedy trial. Felix was one of the hearing officers, Roman hearing officers, and he promised a speedy trial, which Rome even had that principle. B, Felix requiring Paul to testify against himself. Rome doesn't allow that for Roman citizens, or people they can't torture. C, lack of defense counsel for Paul before Felix. They're supposed to have an appointed counsel, just like we do in America today, if necessary. D, allowing multiple accusers before Felix. So how these were presented, I think, is what he means. E, ex parte presentation of charges to Festus as a judge. That's an irregularity in any judicial system. You should go through, keep the judge not having to talk to the participants directly. F, multiple accusers before Festus. G, lack of defense counsel before Festus. Again, no attorney. H, relative lightness of Paul's pretrial imprisonment in Rome. That's an interesting irregularity. Wouldn't that be a good thing? But on the other hand, that might have been a bad thing. It means people could come kill him. Maybe that's what is being suggested there. I don't know. All right. Next, I want to go into Mr. Mauck's presentation that Theophilus was not a Christian. I'm going to take a quick break. All right. Mr. Mauck writes, Theophilus was not a Christian. Finally, the textual evidence will show that Acts was not written to a believer, but to provide the background of Christianity, facts relevant to the charges against Paul, and legal arguments germane to his defense. And I think, as I mentioned at the beginning of this video, that's exactly what all the evidence proves. This was not written to Christians, because we would be offended by so many details, as we mentioned at the beginning. Now, he has a separate section here, and I want you to see this. He's saying that this is a summary that proves that Luke is not trying to address theological issues with Theophilus, which he's put in the right column. Theological issues are not explained or mentioned, and he lists them there. On the left side, he's showing you what issues are being addressed, and they're all legal issues for a case. So on the left side, Mr. Mauck lists the legal issues that are being explained. One, the legality of faith and admission of Gentiles. That'd be something that a lawyer can dig into and figure out. Two, handling of money in the church. That'd be something of concern for legal affairs about churches, and are they managed properly? Are they stealing? Three, no threat to Roman military government. That's a subject matter in Luke's presentation. Four, now this is interesting. He says that Luke pays attention to the demonic encounters. And again, this is appealing to pagans, not to Christians, that the demonic people are being controlled, or also the demons that are influential and considered good demons, like the Python priestess. She's empowering Paul and giving him a lot of kudos. But I will say Mr. Mauck doesn't ever notice who she really is, because he never noticed her name was really a Python, because that name is never translated in any of our English Bibles, with one exception. That's Young's literal puts out the word Python. That's how I found the whole issue. I was reading it because I used to read it regularly, and that's where I saw it. So he never catches that. 5, Paul's extensive education and Pharisaic credentials. So he pays a lot of attention to the credibility, or the best credibility he can put forward for Paul from that basis. Okay, before I read you this paragraph, this is answering the question of who is Theophilus and what is the probable role he was playing. However, the early church, as I showed you earlier, 1720, Heumann dug it up that the early church said he was the magistrate assistant to Nero. So that's actually what we should take as fact. But here you're going to see that a role here is being described that could be a magistrate's role as well. So, but he doesn't say the word magistrate here. So I just want to show you, he's going to tell you a role that could be given to a magistrate as well. So it doesn't exclude the magistrate being the legal office of, if you will, of Theophilus. So here we go. Probably Theophilus held the office of a cognitionibus, an investigator, was a member of Nero's concilium. These also sound like they could be a magistrate. He hasn't said this yet. Or was in some formal capacity charged with the gathering of information for the trial, in much the same way modern judges delegate parts of the complex trial preparation to magistrates or special masters. So there's where he's implying that could be what they are. But again, that's what the early church actually said it was, according to Heuman's research in 1720. The charges against Paul and the import of these charges would most certainly have justified a special investigation under Roman law, cognitio extra ordinem, and a man assigned to the investigation. Such an investigator would have wanted much background information about Jesus and his earlier followers in order to contextualize both the accusations and the defense. Then he would have wanted the information to narrow the focus to Paul and the specific charges against him. That's precisely what the book of Acts does. Okay, so that concludes this episode, and I hope you learned who is Theophilus according to the book of Mr. Mauck, and it turns out he was right on because it matched what Mr. Heumann had concluded based on early church records in 1720. All right, everybody, God bless. Take care. Good night. Ciao.